After a swim in the hotel pool, my 6-year-old daughter Cassie and my 4-year-old son Colton sat in a big round booth at the Chicago restaurant, old Chicago restaurant in Greeley, Colorado, coloring happily while my wife Sonia and I chatted with Pastor Steve Wilson and his wife Rebecca. We had enjoyed the meal, including my children's usual favorites, pizza, spaghetti, and garlic bread. Steve was senior pastor of a church of almost 2,000 people, nearly as many people as lived in our hometown of Imperial. It was a chance for Sonia and me to get to know another pastor in our district and to get some ideas on how other pastors do ministry. We planned to visit Steve's church, Greeley Wesleyan, the next day. Sonia especially wanted to get a look at how the church's Sunday morning children's program worked. Rebecca divided her time between the grown-up conversation and coloring with the children. "Wow, Colton, you're doing a really good job coloring that pizza," she said. Colton offered a thin, polite smile, but had fallen unusually quiet. Then a few minutes later, he said, "Mommy, my tummy hurts." Sonia and I exchanged a glance. Was it the stomach flu coming back? Sonia laid the back of her hand against Colton's cheek and shook her head. "You don't feel hot, hun." "I think I'm going to throw up," Colton said. "I don't feel so good either, Mommy," Cassie said. We figured it was something they ate. With both children feeling under the weather, we ended our dinner early and said goodbye to the Wilsons and headed back to the hotel, which was just across the parking lot from the restaurant. As soon as we got the door to our room open, Colton's prediction came true. He threw up, beginning on the carpet and ending as Sonia whisked him into the tiny bathroom in the toilet. Standing in the bathroom doorway, I watched Colton's small form bent over and convulsing. This didn't seem like any kind of food poisoning. Gotta be that stomach flu, I thought. This was how the evening began. It continued with Colton throwing up every 30 minutes like clockwork. Between times, Sonia sat in an upholstered side chair with Colton on her lap, keeping the room's ice bucket within reach in case she couldn't make it to the bathroom. About 2 hours into this cycle, another child joined the party as Colton was in the bathroom heaving into the toilet with Sonia kneeling beside him, a steadying hand on his back. Cassie ran in and threw up in the tub. "Todd," Sonia called, "I need a little help in here." Great, I thought. Now they both have it. Or did they? After we were able to move both children back to the bedroom, Sonia and I put our heads together. Colton had seemed to kick that stomach flu the day before, and all day long at the butterfly pavilion, he was his normal self, completely happy, except for the strain of holding Rosie the spider to get that sticker. Cassie had held Rosie too. Could Goliath tarantulas trigger a case of vomiting? No, I told myself. I pushed the thought aside. Did the children eat the same thing at the restaurant? I asked Sonia, who by then was lying on one of the double beds with one arm around each of our two green at the gills children. She looked at the ceiling and thought for a moment. I think they both had some pizza, but we all had pizza. I think it's that flu. Colton probably wasn't over it quite yet, and he passed it along to Cassie before we got here. The doctor said it was pretty contagious. No matter what, it looked like our relaxing post-turmoil celebration trip was abruptly coming to an end. And a few minutes later, I heard the magic words that seemed to confirm my thoughts. "Mommy, I feel like I'm going to throw up again." Sonia snatched up Colton and hustled him to the toilet again, just in the nick of time. When the pink light of dawn began peeking through the curtains the next morning, Sonia was still awake. We had agreed that at least one of us should still go visit Greeley Wesleyan Church and get some large church ministry knowledge we could export back to our hometown in Imperial. So I tried to get at least a little sleep. That left Sonia with nursing duties, which included an almost hourly trek back and forth to the bathroom with Colton. Cassie had gotten sick only one other time during the night, but whatever this bug was, it seemed to have latched onto our little boy's body and dug in deep. We checked out of the hotel early and drove over to the Greeley home of Phil and Betty Lou Harris, our close friends and also superintendents for the Wesleyan Church District that includes all of Colorado and Nebraska. The original plan had been that our two families would attend the Wilsons' church together that morning. Now, though, with a pair of sick children, we decided that Sonia would stay at the Harris's home. Betty Lou, sweet lady that she is, volunteered to stay home and assist. When I got back from church just after lunch, Sonia gave me the status report. Cassie was feeling a lot better. She had even been able to eat a little something and keep it down. But Colton continued to vomit on a clockwork basis and had been unable to hold anything down. Colton was in the Harris's living room, huddled in the corner of the huge couch on top of a blanket/drop cloth with a bucket standing nearby just in case. I walked over and sat down beside him. "Hey buddy, not doing so great, huh?" Colton slowly shook his head and tears welled up in his blue eyes. I might have been in my 30s, but over the last few months I'd learned only too well what it was like to feel so sick and miserable that you just wanted to cry. My heart hurt for my son. "Come here," I said. I pulled him into my lap and looked into his little round face. His eyes, usually sparkling and playful, looked flat and weak. Phil walked over and sat down beside me and reviewed the symptoms: abdominal pain, profuse vomiting, a fever that had come and gone. Could it be appendicitis? I thought about it for a moment. There was certainly a family history. My uncle's appendix had burst, and I'd had a wicked case of appendicitis in college during the time Sonia and I were dating. Also, Sonia had had her appendix out when she was in second grade. But the circumstances here didn't seem to fit the bill. The doctor in Imperial had diagnosed him with a stomach flu, and if it was appendicitis, there would be no reason Cassie would be sick too. We spent Sunday night with the Harrises in Greeley. By morning, Cassie had completely recovered, but Colton had spent a second night throwing up. As we packed our duffel bags and headed outside to load up the expedition, Phil gazed at Colton, cradled in Sonia's arms. "He looks pretty sick to me, Todd. Maybe you should take him to the hospital here." Sonia and I had discussed that option. We had sat in emergency room waiting areas with a sick child before, and our experience was that we could probably make the 3-hour drive back to Imperial before we would be seen in the emergency room of a Metro Denver hospital. So instead, we called ahead to Imperial and made an appointment with our regular family doctor, the one Colton had seen the previous Friday. I explained our reasoning to Phil. He said he understood, but I could tell he was still worried. And by the time we'd been on the road for an hour or so, I began to think that maybe he had been right. For Sonia, our first red flag waved when we stopped at a Safeway just outside Greeley to buy pull-ups. Colton, who had been potty trained for more than 2 years, had tickled in his underwear. It worried Sonia that he didn't even protest when she laid him down in the back seat of the expedition and helped him into a pair of pull-ups. Under normal circumstances, he would have been indignant. "I'm not a baby." Now, though, he didn't utter a peep. Instead, once strapped back into his car seat, he only clutched his belly and moaned. 2 hours into the drive, he was crying constantly, stopping about every 30 minutes to throw up again. In the rearview mirror, I could see the heartbreak and helplessness on my wife's face. Meanwhile, I tried to focus on the goal: get him to Imperial, get some IVs in him, stop the dehydration that surely must be setting in as this flu ran its course. We reached Imperial in just under 3 hours. At the hospital, the nurse took us back to an examination room pretty quickly, with Sonia carrying Colton, cradling his head against her shoulder, the way she had when he was an infant. Within a few minutes, the doctor who had seen Colton on Friday joined us, and we brought him up to date on the situation. After a brief exam, he ordered blood tests and an x-ray, and I think I took a breath for the first time since we rolled out of Greeley. This was progress. We were doing something. In a short while, we'd have a diagnosis, probably a prescription or two, and Colton would be on the way to recovery. We took Colton to the lab, where he screamed as a tech tried her best to find a vein. That was followed by x-rays that were better only because we convinced Colton that there were no needles involved. Within an hour, we were back in the exam room with the doctor. "Could it be appendicitis?" Sonia asked the doctor. He shook his head. "No, Colton's white blood cell count isn't consistent with appendicitis. We are concerned, though, about his x-rays." I looked at Sonia. It was at that moment we realized we'd been banking on a really nasty virus. We were completely unprepared for something more serious. The doctor led us into the hallway where there was already an X-ray clipped to an illuminator. When I saw what was in the picture, my heart dropped into my stomach. The X-ray of our son's tiny little torso showed 3 dark masses. It looked for all the world as if his insides had exploded. Sonia began shaking her head, and tears, which had hovered just beneath the surface, spilled onto her cheeks. "Are you sure it's not appendicitis?" I asked the doctor. "There's a family history." Again, he said no. "That's not what the blood tests show." "Then what is it?" "I'm not sure," he said. That was Monday, March 3rd. Nurses placed Colton in a room and inserted an IV. 2 bags dangled from the top of a stainless steel pole, one for hydration and one for antibiotics of some kind. Sonia and I prayed together for Colton. Norma stopped by with Colton's favorite toy, his Spider-Man action figure. Normally his eyes would have lit up at the sight of either Norma or Spider-Man, but Colton didn't react at all. Later, our friend Terry brought Colton's best buddy, her son Hunter, to visit. Again, Colton was unresponsive, almost lifeless. Sitting in a chair near Colton's bed, Norma looked at Sonia grimly. "I think you should take him to Children's Hospital in Denver." But at that point, we were trusting in the doctors, confident that everything was being done that could be done. Besides, Colton was no condition to travel all the way back to Colorado. Colton continued to throw up. Sonia held down the fort, comforting him, catching his vomit, while I drove home to check in on the rest of our lives. On the way, I stopped by the church to make sure the place hadn't burned down. I checked in with my garage door guys, returned some phone calls from the new customers, and went out to do a door repair job. The entire time I was away from the hospital, I sent up prayers. Even during my conversations with others, my prayers ascended, a kind of mental background music that would have been in the foreground, the only ground, if only life didn't have an annoying way of rolling on. Sonia spent Monday night at the hospital, and I stayed home with Cassie. On Tuesday morning, I took her to school. During the rest of the day, between church and company responsibilities, I popped in and out of the hospital as often as I could, hoping for some improvement. Instead, each time I walked into Colton's room, I saw my little boy slipping deeper into the grip of whatever mysterious monster held him. Not only was he not getting better, he was getting worse faster. By the second afternoon, I saw something that terrified me: the shadow of death. I recognized it instantly. As a pastor, you sometimes find yourself on a death watch in a hospital, a nursing home, a hospice. There are telltale signs. The skin loses its pinkness and fades into a jaundiced yellow. Breathing is labored. The eyes are open, but the person is not seemingly present. And most telling of all, a sinking and darkening around the eyes. I had seen this look many times, but in a context where you might expect it, in a patient suffering from terminal cancer or in the final phases of some other disease. You know that person's life on earth has come down to days, then hours, then minutes. I would be there to comfort the family and pray with them. Prayers like, "God, please take her soon. Please take away her pain." This time, though, I was seeing the shadow of death again, and I was seeing it on my son, my not quite 4-year-old son. The sight hit me like a bullet. A voice screamed inside my head, "We're not doing anything." I'm a pacer. I wore ruts in the floor of Colton's room, crossing the tiny space again and again like a caged lion. My stomach churned. Inside my chest, an invisible vice squeezed my heart. "He's getting worse, God. What do we do?" While I paced, Sonia channeled her anxiety into the role of a busy caretaker. She fluffed Colton's pillow, arranged his blankets, made sure he was still drinking. It was a role she was filling to keep from exploding. Each time I looked at her, I could see the agitation growing in her eyes. Our son was slipping away. And like me, she wanted to know what was wrong. The doctors would bring back test results, and more test results. But no answers, only useless observations. He doesn't seem to be responding to the medication. I don't know. I wish the surgeon was here. Sonia and I wrestled with trust. We weren't doctors. We had no medical experience. I'm a pastor. She's a teacher. We wanted to trust. We wanted to believe the medical professionals were doing everything that could be done. We kept thinking, next time the doctor walks in, he'll have a new test result. He'll change the medication. He'll do something that'll get that look of death off our son. But he didn't. And there came a point when we had to draw the line. On Wednesday, we broke the news to the Imperial Hospital staff that we were taking Colton to the Great Plains Regional Medical Center in North Platte. We considered Norma's suggestion of Children's Hospital in Denver, but felt it would be better to stay closer to our base of support. It took a while to get Colton checked out, as it does any time you leave a hospital, but to us it seemed an eternity. Finally, a nurse came in with the discharge papers, a copy of Colton's test results, and a large, flat brown envelope containing his x-rays. Sonia called ahead to the office of pediatrician Dr. Adele Shepard to let his staff know we were coming. At 10:30 a.m., I picked Colton up out of the hospital bed and was shocked to see the limpness of his body. He felt like a rag in my arms. It would have been a great time to panic, but I tried to keep my cool. At least we were doing something now. We were taking action. Colton's car seat strapped into the back seat of our SUV. Gently, I laid him in, wondering as I buckled him in how fast I could make the 90-minute trip to the hospital. Sonia climbed into the back seat with Colton, armed with a pink plastic hospital dish for catching vomit. The day was sunny but cold. As I steered the SUV onto Highway 61, I twisted the rearview mirror so that I could see Colton. Several miles passed in silence. Then I heard him retching into the bowl. When he finished, I pulled over so that Sonia could empty it onto the side of the road. Then back on the highway, I glanced in the mirror and saw Sonia slip the x-ray film from the brown envelope and hold it up in the streaming sunlight. Slowly, she began shaking her head and tears filled her eyes. "We messed up," she said, her voice breaking over the images she would later tell me were burned in her mind forever. I turned my head back enough to see the 3 small explosions she was staring at. The misshapen blotches seemed huge in the ghostly image of Colton's tiny torso. Why did they seem so much bigger now? "You're right, we should have known," I said. "But the doctor—" "I know, we shouldn't have listened." There wasn't any finger-pointing, no blaming each other, but we were both really upset with ourselves. We had tried to do the right thing at each step. The doctor said x-rays, we did x-rays. The doctor said IVs, we did IVs. The doctor said blood tests, we did blood tests. He was the doctor, right? He knew what he was doing, right? At each turning point, we had tried to make the right call, but we had made the wrong ones, and now Colton was paying for it. A helpless child was suffering the consequences of our mistakes. Behind me, Colton slumped lifelessly in his car seat, and his silence was louder than any sound I'd ever heard. There's a story in the Bible about King David of Israel. David had committed adultery with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of David's trusted soldiers. Then, in an effort to cover up his sin, David sent Uriah to the front lines of the battle, where David knew he would be killed. Later, the prophet Nathan came to David and said basically, "Look, God knows what you did, and here are the consequences of your sin. The child that you and Bathsheba have conceived will not live." David tore his clothes and cried and prayed and pleaded. He was so grief-stricken that when the baby died, his servants were afraid to come and tell him. But David figured it out, and when he did, he got up, washed himself, ate, calmly took care of the funeral. His behavior confused his servants, who said, "Hey, wait a minute, weren't you just freaking out a few minutes ago? Weren't you just pleading and crying before God? Now you're so calm. Why?" David explained, "I was hoping the situation would change, but it didn't." In his mind, David had been doing what he could while there was still something that seemed could be done. When I think back on that drive to the hospital, that's how I felt. Yes, the x-rays looked bad and my son's face was covered in death, but he wasn't dead yet. Now was not the time to quit and mourn. Now was the time for prayer and action. God, help us get there. Let us help our son. As a father, I felt I had blown it, but maybe there was still something I could do to redeem myself. That hope was probably the only thing that kept me from falling apart. We arrived about noon and made a beeline for the pediatrician's office. I hustled out of the SUV and bundled Colton in a blanket, carrying him in my arms like a fireman. Sonia gathered up our gear and followed me in, still carrying the hospital bowl. At the reception desk, a pleasant woman greeted us. "We're the Burbos," I said. "We called ahead from Imperial about our son. The doctor has gone to lunch." Gone to lunch? I thought. "But we called ahead," I said. "He knew we were coming." "Please have a seat," the receptionist said. "The doctor will be back in 10 or 15 minutes. Her routine manner told me she did not feel the urgency in our situation, and inside me a rocket of anger went off. On the outside, though, I kept my cool. I could have screamed and shouted, but it wouldn't have done any good. Also, I'm a pastor. We don't have the luxury of publicly losing it. Sonia and I found a seat in the waiting area, and 15 minutes later, the doctor arrived. He had the soothing appearance of maturity, silver hair, glasses, a trim mustache. The nursing staff ushered us back to an exam room, and Sonia handed him the packet of tests we brought along with the x-rays. He examined Colton so briefly that it occurred to me he might be making up for lost time. "I'm going to order a CT scan," he said. "You'll need to head across the street to the hospital." He meant the Great Plains Regional Medical Center. 10 minutes later, we found ourselves in the imaging clinic in perhaps the most important argument of our lives. "No," Colton shouted. "But Colton, you have to drink it." "No, it's yucky." Colton's screams of protest echoed through the clinic. He was so exhausted, so frail, so tired of throwing up. And now we were trying to make him drink a thick, gritty, cherry red solution that a sane adult wouldn't drink voluntarily in a million years. Finally, Colton took a little sip, but then immediately heaved it up again. Sonia swooped in to catch it in the bowl. "He's throwing up all the time," I told the imaging technician. "How's he going to drink it?" "I'm sorry, sir. He has to drink it so we can get the best images." "Please, please don't make me drink it, Daddy," Colton shouted. We tried everything. We played good cop, bad cop, Sonia coaxing while I threatened, but the firmer I got, the more Colton clamped his teeth together and refused the sticky liquid. I tried reasoning. "Colton, if you can just get this down, the doctors can do this test and we can get you feeling better. Don't you want to feel better?" Sniffles. "Yeah." "Well, here then, take a drink." "No, don't make me." We were desperate. If he didn't drink the fluid, they couldn't do the CT scan. Without the CT scan, they couldn't diagnose. Without a diagnosis, they couldn't treat our son. The battle raged for nearly an hour until finally a technician came out and had mercy on us. "Let's go ahead and take him in. We'll just do the best we can." Inside the imaging room, Sonia stood with the tech behind the radiation shield while I stood beside a listless Colton as the moving table slid him into a big, scary tube. Showing tenderness and compassion, the tech stopped the table before it slid Colton fully into the machine, allowing him to keep his head out so he could see me. The machine whirred to life and Colton stared at me through eyes pinched with pain. And just like that, the test was over. The technician scanned the pictures, then escorted us out of the lab. He did not take us back to the main waiting room, but to an isolated hallway where a few chairs lined the wall. The technician looked at me somberly. "You need to wait here," he said. At the time, I didn't even notice that he had not asked Colton to get dressed. The three of us sat in a cold, narrow hallway, Sonia cradling Colton, his head against her shoulder. She was crying pretty steadily now. Looking in her eyes, I could see that her hope had drained away. This wasn't the normal place where you wait. The technician had separated us out. He had seen the picture and knew it was something bad. Sonia looked down at Colton lying in her arms, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. She and Colton did everything together. This was her little boy, her pal. More than that, this little blonde-haired, blue-eyed fireball was a heavenly blessing, a healing gift after the baby that we had lost. 5 years earlier, Sonia had been pregnant with our second child. We were over the moon about it, seeing this new life as the rounding out of our family. When it was just the two of us, we were a couple. When Cassie was born, we became a family. With the second child on the way, we could begin to see the outlines of the future. Family portraits, a house filled with the joyful noise of childhood, 2 children checking their stockings on Christmas morning. Then 2 months into the pregnancy, Sonia lost the baby, and our misty-edged dreams popped like soap bubbles. Grief consumed Sonia. The reality of a child lost, an empty space where there wasn't one before. We were eager to try again, but worried about whether we would be able to have another child, multiplying our misery. A few months later, Sonia became pregnant again. Her early prenatal checkups revealed a healthy, growing baby. Still, we hung on a bit loosely, a little afraid to fall in love with this new child as we had the one we had lost. But 40 weeks later, on May 19th, 1999, Colton Todd Burpo arrived, and we fell head over heels. For Sonia, this little boy was an even more special gift directly from the hand of a loving Heavenly Father. Now, as I watched her face above Colton's pale form, I could see terrible questions forming in her mind. What are you doing, God? Are you going to take this child too? Colton's face appeared pinched and pale, his face a tiny moon in the stark hallway. The shadows around his eyes had deepened into dark purple hollows. He wasn't screaming anymore or even crying. He was just still. Again, it reminded me of those dying patients I had seen hovering on the threshold between earth and eternity. Tears filled my eyes, blurring the image of my son like rain on a windowpane. Sonia looked up at me, her own tears streaming. "I think this is it," she said. "5 minutes later, a white-coated man emerged from the imaging lab. I don't remember his name, but I remember that his name tag said radiologist. "Your son has a ruptured appendix," he said. "He needs emergency surgery. They're ready for you in surgical prep now. Follow me." Astonished, Sonia and I fell in behind him. Heat surged in my temples. A burst appendix? Hadn't the doctor in Imperial ruled that out? In the surgical prep room, Sonia laid Colton on a gurney, kissed his forehead, and stepped away as a nurse closed in with an IV bag and a needle. Immediately, Colton began to scream and thrash. I stood at my son's head and held his shoulders down, trying to soothe him with my voice. Sonia returned to Colton's side, crying openly as she kept trying to brace his left arm and leg with her body. When I looked up, the prep room was crowded with men and women in white coats and scrubs. "The surgeon is here," one of them said gently. "If you'll step out and talk with him, we'll take him over in there." Reluctantly, we stepped through the curtain, Colton screaming, "Please, Daddy, don't go." In the hallway, Dr. Timothy O'Halloran waited for us. Dr. O'Halloran was the doctor who had performed the lumpectomy on me 4 months earlier. Now his features were set in grim, horizontal lines. He didn't waste words. "Colton's appendix has ruptured. He's not in good shape. We're going to go in and try to clean him out." On the other side of the curtain, Colton was still screaming, "Daddy, Daddy." Gritting my teeth, I shut out the sound and tried to focus on the doctor. "We asked about a burst appendix in Imperial," Sonia said. "They ruled it out." My brain skipped over the past and looked toward the future, angling for hope. "How do you think he'll do?" I said. "We've got to go in and clean him out. We'll know more when we open him up." The spaces between his words rang in my ears like alarm bells as Colton's screams rang down the halls. In response to a direct question, the doctor had specifically not given us any assurances. In fact, the only thing he had said about Colton was that he was in bad shape. My mind flashed back to the moment Sonia called me in Greeley from Imperial to tell me Colton's fever had broken and that they were on their way. What had seemed like the end of a stomach flu had more likely been the first sign of a ruptured appendix. That meant poison had been filling our little boy's belly for 5 days. That tally explained the shadow of death we saw in him now, and it explained why Dr. O'Halloran had not offered us any hope. The doctor nodded toward the noise spilling from the prep room. I think it'll work better if we take him back to surgery and sedate him, then put in the IV. He stepped in over the curtain and I heard him give the order. A few moments later, 2 nurses wheeled the gurney through the curtain and I saw Colton writhing. He twisted his tiny form, turning his head until he locked onto me with his sunken eyes. "Daddy, don't let them take me." Remember when I said pastors don't have the luxury of losing it in public? I was about to lose it, and I had to get away. After talking to the doctor and then scribbling my name on what seemed to be hundreds of insurance forms, nearly running, I found a small room with a door and ducked in, slammed it shut behind me. My heart raced. I couldn't get my breath. Desperation, anger, and frustration washed over me in waves that seemed to squeeze my breath away. When everybody's freaking out, they all look to Dad, especially when Dad's a pastor. Now I was finally in a room where no one was looking at me, and I began raging at God. Where are you? Is this how you treat your pastors? Is it even worth it to serve you? Back and forth, I paced the room, which seemed to close in on me, shrinking as surely as Colton's options were shrinking. Over and over, a single image assaulted me, Colton being wheeled away, his arms stretched out, screaming for me to save him. That's when it hit me. We waited too long. I might never see my son alive again. Tears of rage flooded my eyes, spilled onto my cheeks. After the leg, the kidney stones, the lumpectomy, this is how you're going to let me celebrate the end of my time of testing. I yelled at God. You're going to take my son? 15 minutes later, maybe more, I emerged from that room dry-eyed. It had been the first time I'd really been alone since the whole ordeal began. I'd wanted to be strong for Sonia, a husband strong for his wife. I found her in the waiting room, using her last drops of cell phone battery to call friends and family. I hugged her and held her as she cried in my shirt and until it stuck to my chest. I used what little battery life was left on my cell phone to call Terry, my secretary, who would in turn activate a prayer chain at the church. This was not a ritual call. I was desperate for prayer, desperate that other believers would bang on the gates of heaven and beg God for the life of our son. Pastors are supposed to be unshakable pillars of solid faith, right? But at that moment, my faith was hanging by a tattered thread and fraying fast. I thought of the times where the scripture says that God answered the prayers not of the sick or dying, but of the friends of the sick or dying. The paralytic man, for example. It was when Jesus saw the faith of the man's friends, he told the paralytic, "Get up, take your mat, and go home." At that moment, I needed to borrow the strength and faith of some other believers. After I hung up with Terry, Sonia and I sat together and prayed, afraid to hope and afraid not to. Time dragged, the minutes moving at the speed of glaciers. Between muted conversations and small talk, the waiting room ticked with a pregnant silence. 90 minutes later, a female nurse in purple scrubs, a surgical mask dangling from her neck, stepped into the waiting room. "Is Colton's father here?" The tone of her voice and the fact that it was a nurse and not Dr. O'Halloran sent a surge of hope through my body. Maybe God is being gracious despite our stupidity. Maybe he's going to give us another day, another chance. I stood. I'm Colton's dad. Mr. Burpo, can you come back? Colton's out of surgery, but we can't calm him down. He's still screaming, and he's screaming for you. When they were wheeling Colton away, I couldn't bear his screams. Now suddenly, I wanted to hear his screams more than I'd ever wanted to hear anything in my life. To me, they would be a beautiful sound. Just knowing that he was still alive. Sonia and I gathered up our things and followed the nurse back through the wide double doors that led to the surgical ward. We didn't make it to the recovery room, but met a pair of nurses wheeling Colton through the hallway on a gurney. He was alert. I could tell he'd been looking for me. My first reaction was to try to get as close to him as I could. I think I would have climbed on the gurney with him if I hadn't thought the nurses might feel a little put out. The nurses stopped long enough for Sonia and I to each plant a kiss on Colton's little face, which still looked pale and drawn. "Hey, buddy, how you doing?" I said. "Hi, Mommy. Hi, Daddy." The ghost of a smile warmed his face. The nurses got the gurney underway again, and a few minutes and an elevator ride later, Colton was settled into a narrow hospital room at the end of a long corridor. Sonia stepped out of the room for a moment to take care of some paperwork at the nurse's station. I stayed behind, sitting next to Colton's bed, in one of those mesh-covered rockers, drinking in my son's aliveness. A small child looks even smaller in a hospital bed built for grown-ups. At under 40 pounds, Colton's body barely raised the sheet. His feet reached no more than a third of the way down the bed. Dark rings still circled his eyes, but it seemed to me that the blue of his eyes shone brighter than 2 hours before. "Daddy?" Colton looked at me earnestly. "What?" He gazed at me and didn't move his eyes from mine. "Daddy, you know I almost died." Fear gripped me. Where did he hear that? Had he overheard the medical staff talking? Had he heard something the surgical team said despite the anesthesia? Because we certainly hadn't said anything about his being close to death in front of him. Sonia and I had feared he was at the brink and known it after we had learned his appendix had been leaking poison into his system for 5 days. But we've been very particular about not saying anything in front of Colton that would scare him. My throat closed, the first sign of tears. Some people freak out when their teenagers want to talk about sex. If you think that's tough, try talking to your preschooler about dying. Colton had been with me in nursing homes, places where people gave their loved ones permission to let go of life. I wasn't about to give my son permission to quit. We weren't out of the woods yet, and I didn't want him to think that death was an option. I willed my voice to remain steady and smiled at my son. "You just think about getting better, okay, buddy?" "Okay, Daddy. We're here with you all the way. We're praying for you." I changed the subject. "Now, what can we bring you? Do you want one of your action figures from home?" We hadn't been in the room long when 3 members of our church board arrived at the hospital. We were so grateful for that. Sometimes I wonder, what do people do when they have no extended family and no church? In times of crisis, where does their support come from? Cassie stayed with Norma and Brian in Imperial until my mother, Kay, could drive up from Ulysses, Kansas. Brian's extended family lives in North Platte, and they came to help us too. Our church gathering around us in the eye of the storm would change the way Sonia and I approached pastoral visitation in times of trial and grief. We were faithful about it before. Now we were militant. Soon, Sonia came back into the room. Not long after that, and Dr. O'Halloran joined us. Colton lay quietly as the surgeon pulled back the sheet to show us the incision site, a horizontal line across the right side of his tiny belly. The wound was packed with blood-tinged gauze. As he began to remove it, Colton whimpered a bit in fear. I don't think he could feel it yet since he was still under the effects of the local anesthesia the surgical team had applied to the incision site. Colton's insides were so contaminated with the poison of the ruptured appendix that Dr. O'Halloran had decided it was best to leave his incision open so it could continue to drain. Now the doctor spread the wound slightly, "See that gray tissue?" he said. "That's what happens to internal organs when there's an infection. Colton's not going to be able to leave the hospital until everything that's gray in there turns pink." A length of plastic tubing protruded from each side of Colton's abdomen. At the end of each tube was what the doctor called a grenade, clear plastic in color. They did look like little grenades, but they were actually manual squeeze pumps. The next morning, Dr. O'Halloran showed us how to squeeze the grenades to drain pus from Colton's abdomen and then pack the opening with fresh gauze. For the next few days, Dr. O'Halloran would arrive each morning to check the wound and pack the dressing. Colton screamed bloody murder during those visits and began to associate the doctor with everything bad that was happening to him. In the evenings, when the doctor wasn't there, I had to drain the incision. Prior to the surgery, Sonia had been on vomit patrol for nearly a week since the surgery, at Colton's bedside every minute. But draining the pus was gory work, and for her, a bridge too far. Besides, it took at least 3 adults to hold Colton down, so while I squeezed the grenade, Sonia helped 2 nurses hold him, Sonia whispering soothing words while Colton screamed and screamed. For another week after the emergency appendectomy, Colton continued to throw up, and we continued to pump poison out of his body twice a day using Dr. O'Halloran's rigging of plastic tubing and grenades. Slowly, gradually, Colton took a turn for the better. The vomiting stopped, his color returned, and he began to eat a little. We knew he was on the mend when he began to sit up and chat with us, play with the video game console the nurses had stationed at his bed, and even take an interest in the brand new stuffed lion that Cassie had brought him several days before. Finally, 7 days after we checked into the hospital, the medical team said we could take our son home. Like soldiers after a long but victorious fight, Sonia and I were both exhausted and overjoyed. On March 13th, we packed up all the debris of a lengthy hospital stay in a hodgepodge of shopping bags, duffel bags, and plastic bags, and headed for the elevators, me pushing Colton in a wheelchair and Sonia holding a thick bouquet of going home balloons. The elevator doors had begun sliding shut when Dr. O'Halloran appeared in the hallway and literally yelled for us to stop. "You can't go, you can't go," his voice echoed in the tile corridor as he waved a sheaf of papers in our direction. "We've still got problems." A last-minute blood test had revealed a radical spike in Colton's white cell count. Dr. O'Halloran told us when he caught us at the elevator. "It's probably another abscess," he said. "We may have to operate again." I thought Sonia was going to pass out right there. Both of us were walking zombies by then and had nearly reached our limit. Colton burst into tears. Another CT scan revealed new pockets of infection in Colton's abdomen. That afternoon, Dr. O'Halloran and his surgical team had to open up our little boy a second time and clean him out again. This time, Sonia and I weren't terrified. The shadow of death had long since passed from Colton's face. But now we had a new worry. Colton hadn't eaten for something like 10 days. He had weighed only about 40 pounds to begin with. Now he had melted away so that his elbows and knees appeared abnormally large in comparison to the rest of his body, his face thin like a hungry orphan. After the surgery, I brought our concerns to Dr. O'Halloran. "He hasn't eaten more than a little jello or broth in almost 2 weeks," I said. "How long can a child go without eating?" Dr. O'Halloran placed Colton in the intensive care unit and ordered an extra nutrition for him, administered through a feeding tube. But the ICU bed was as much for us as for Colton, I suspect. We hadn't slept for nearly as long as Colton hadn't eaten, and we were absolutely ragged. Putting Colton in ICU was the only way the doctor could get us to go get some rest. "Colton will be fine tonight," he told us. "He'll have his own nurse at all times, and if anything happens, someone will be right there to take care of him." I have to admit, those words sounded like an oasis in a desert of exhaustion. We were afraid to leave Colton alone, but we knew Dr. O'Halloran was right. That night was the first night since leaving the Harris's home in Greeley that Sonia and I spent together. We talked, we cried, we encouraged each other. but mostly we slept like shipwreck survivors on their first warm, dry night. After a night in the ICU, Colton was moved to yet another hospital room, and the wait-and-see cycle began all over again. When can Colton get out of here? When can we go home and be normal again? Now, though Colton's bowels seemed to have stopped working, he couldn't use the bathroom, and hour by hour he grew more miserable. "Daddy, my tummy hurts," he moaned, lying in bed. The doctor said that even if Colton could pass gas, that would be a good sign. We tried to help him by walking him up and down the halls to shake things loose, but Colton could only shuffle along slowly, hunched over in pain. Nothing seemed to help. By the fourth day after the second surgery, he could only lie on the bed, writhing as constipation set in. That afternoon, Dr. O'Halloran came with more bad news. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you've been through a lot, but I think we've done everything for Colton we can do here. We're thinking maybe it would be best to transfer him to a children's hospital, either the one in Omaha or the one in Denver." Between us, we'd managed something like 5 nights sleep in 15 days. After more than 2 grueling weeks at Colton's bedside, we had nearly hit the road back to normal, with the elevator doors literally closing our family inside with balloons, when the whole thing crashed around us again, and now our son was back in excruciating pain with no end in sight. We couldn't even see a horizon. Just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. A freak spring snowstorm was moving into the Midwest. Within a couple of hours, thick drifts of snow lay piled against the hospital doors and wheel well high in the parking lots. Whether we chose the Children's Hospital in Omaha 8 hours away or Denver 3 hours away, there would be no way short of an airlift that we could reach either one. That's when Sonia lost it. "I can't do this anymore," she said, and broke down in tears. And right about then was when a group of people in our church decided it was time for some serious prayer. Church friends began making phone calls, and before long, around 80 people had driven over to Crosswood Roads, Wesleyan, for a prayer service. Some were in our congregation and some were from other churches, but they had all come together to pray for our son. Brad Dillon called me on my cell phone to tell me what was going on. "What specifically can we pray for?" he asked. Feeling a little odd about it, I told him what Dr. O'Halloran had said would be a good sign for Colton. So that night might be the only time in recorded history that 80 people gathered and prayed for someone to pass gas. Of course, they prayed for a break in the weather so we could get to Denver, and they prayed for healing too. But within an hour, the first prayer was answered. Immediately, Colton began to feel better. That evening, he was able to use the bathroom. By the next morning, he was up in his room playing as though none of this nightmare had ever happened. Watching him, Sonia and I couldn't believe our eyes. Except for being skinny, Colton was completely and utterly himself again. In less than 12 hours, we had cycled from completely desperate to completely normal. Around 9 a.m., Dr. O'Halloran came back in to check in on his patient. When he saw Colton up, smiling and chipper, playing with his action figures, the doctor was speechless. For a long moment, he actually just stood and stared. Astonished, he examined Colton and then scheduled another round of tests to be triple sure that Colton's insides were on the mend. This time, Colton literally skipped all the way to the CT scan lab. We stayed in the hospital another day and a half just to be certain Colton's turnaround stuck. During those 36 hours, it seemed we had more nurses in and out than usual. Slowly, one at a time, and in pairs, they would slip into the room, and each time their reaction was the same. They just stood and stared at our little boy. After we got home from the hospital, we slept for a week. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but not much. Sonia and I were completely drained. It was like we had just been through a 17-day almost car crash. Our wounds weren't visible on the outside, but the soul-tearing worry and tension had taken its toll. One evening, about a week after we got home, Sonia and I were standing in the kitchen talking about money. She stood over a portable table next to our microwave, sorting through the enormous stack of mail that had accumulated during Colton's hospital stay. Each time she opened an envelope, she jotted down a number on a sheet of paper lying on the counter. Even from where I stood, leaning against the cabinets on the opposite side of the kitchen, I could see that the column of figures was getting awfully long. Finally, she clicked the pen closed and laid it on the counter. Do you know how much money I need to pay the bills this week? As both the family and business bookkeeper, Sonia asked me that question regularly. She worked part-time as a teacher, so we had that steady income, but it was a relatively small stream. My pastor's salary was also small, cobbled together from the tithes of a small but faithful congregation. So the bulk of the earning came from our garage door business, and that income waxed and waned with the seasons. Every couple of weeks, she presented me with the figures, not only on household bills, but on business payables. Now there were also several massive hospital bills. I performed a rough tally in my head and offered her a guess. Probably close to $23,000, right? Yep, she said and sighed. It might as well have been $1 million. With me unable to work the garage door jobs because of my broken leg and then the hyperplasia, we had already burned through our savings. Then just when I was getting back into full swing, Colton's illness hit, knocking me out of work for nearly another month. We had about as much chance of coming up with $23,000 as we did of winning the lottery. And since we don't play the lottery, those chances were zero. Do you have any receivables, anything due you can collect? Sonia said. She asked because she had to, but she knew the answer. I shook my head. I can put off some of these, she said, nodding toward the envelope stack, but the 10th bills are definitely due. Here's a great picture of how small a town Imperial actually is. Folks have tabs or accounts they run at places like the gas station, the grocery store, the hardware store. So if we need a fill-up or a loaf of bread, we just swing by and sign for it. Then on the 10th of the month, Sonia makes a 50-minute trip around town to settle up. Our 10th bills are one of the cool things about living in a small town. On the other hand, when you can't pay, it's a lot more humbling. I sighed. I can go explain the situation, ask for more time. Sonia held up a sheaf of papers a little thicker than the others. The medical bills are starting to come in. One of them is $34,000. How much will the insurance cover? There's a $3,200 deductible. We can't even pay that right now, I said. Do you still want me to write the tithe check? Sonia asked, referring to our regular weekly donation to the church. Absolutely, I said. God had just given us our son back. There was no way we were not going to give back to God. At just that moment, Colton came around the corner from the living room and surprised us with a strange proclamation that I can still hear to this day. He stood at the end of the counter with his hands on his hips. Dad, Jesus used Dr. O'Halloran to fix me, he said. His preschool face was oddly self-assured. You need to pay him. Then he turned around and marched out, around the corner and gone. Sonia and I looked at each other. What? We were both a little taken aback since Colton had seen the surgeon as the source of all the poking, cutting, prodding, draining, and pain. Now here we were just a week out of the hospital and he seemed to have changed his mind. Well, I guess he likes Dr. O'Halloran now, Sonia said. Even if Colton had found it in his heart to forgive the good doctor, though, his little proclamation in the kitchen was weird. How many not quite 4-year-olds analyze the family financial woes and demand payment for a creditor, especially one he never particularly liked? And the way he put it, too. Dad, Jesus used Dr. O'Halloran to help fix me. Weird. Even weirder, though, was what happened next. With $23,000 in bills due and payable immediately, we didn't know what we were going to do. Sonia and I discussed asking our bank for a loan, but it turned out we didn't need to. First, my grandma Ellen, who lives in Ulysses, Kansas, sent us a check to help with the hospital bills. Then, in a single week, more checks started arriving in the mail. Checks for $50, $100, $200, and all with cards and notes that said things like, "We heard about your troubles and we're praying for you," or "God put it on my heart to send you this. I hope it helps." By the end of the week, our mailbox was full again, but with gifts, not bills. Church members, close friends, and even people who only knew us from a distance responded to our need without our even asking. The checks added up to thousands of dollars, and we were astonished when we found that, combined with what my grandmother sent, the total was what we needed to meet that first wave of bills, almost to the dollar. Not long after Colton became a pint-sized collection agent, he got in a little bit of trouble. Nothing huge, just an incident at a friend's house where he got into a tug-of-war over some toys. That evening I called him to the kitchen table. I was sitting in a straight-back chair, and he climbed on up in the chair beside me and knelt in it. Colton leaned on his elbows and regarded me with sky-blue eyes that seemed a little bit sheepish. If you have a preschooler, you know it can sometimes be hard to look past their cuteness and be serious about discipline. But I managed to put on a serious face. "Colton," I began, "do you know why you're in trouble?" "Yeah, because I didn't share," he said, casting his eyes down at the table. "That's right. You can't do that, Colton. You have to treat people better than that." Colton raised his eyes and looked at me. "Yeah, I know, Dad. Jesus told me I had to be nice." His words caught me by surprise. It was the way he said it. "Jesus told me." But I brushed it aside. His Sunday school teachers must be doing a good job, I thought. "Well then, Jesus was right, wasn't he?" I said, and that was the end of it. I don't even think I gave Colton any consequences for not sharing. After all, with Jesus in the picture, I'd pretty much been outranked. A couple of weeks later, I began preparing to preside over a funeral at church. The man who had passed away wasn't a member of our congregation, but people in town who don't attend services regularly often want a church funeral for a loved one. Sometimes the deceased is a friend or relative of a church member. Colton must have heard Sonia and me discussing the upcoming service, because he walked into the front room one morning and tugged on my shirt tail. "Daddy, what's a funeral?" I had done several funerals at church since Colton was born, but he was at that age where he was starting to become more interested in how and why things work. "Well, buddy, a funeral happens when someone dies. A man here in town died, and his family is coming to the church to say goodbye to him." Instantly, Colton's demeanor changed. His face fell into serious lines, and he stared fiercely into my eyes. "Did the man have Jesus in his heart?" My son was asking me whether the man who had died was a Christian who had accepted Christ as his Savior, but his intensity caught me off guard. "I'm not sure, Colton," I said. "I didn't know him very well." Colton's face bunched up in a terrible twist of worry. He said, "He had to have Jesus in his heart. He had to know Jesus, or he can't get into heaven." Again, his intensity surprised me, especially since he didn't even know this man. I tried to comfort him as best I could. "I've talked to some of the family members, and they told me he did," I said. Colton didn't seem entirely convinced, but his face relaxed a bit. "Well, okay," he said, and walked away. For the second time in a couple of weeks, I thought, man, those Sunday school teachers sure are doing a good job. That weekend, Sonia dressed Cassie and Colton in their Sunday best, and we headed the half block down to the church to get ready for the funeral. As we pulled up in the SUV, I saw the funeral home hearse parked outside. Inside, we found the burnished oak casket standing off to one side of the foyer. Two sets of open doorways led from the foyer into the sanctuary, where the family was gathering for the flower service. Before moving to Imperial, I had never heard of a flower service, but now I think it's a really nice idea. The family gathers before the funeral service, and the funeral director points out each plant, wreath, and flower arrangement, explains who sent it, reads aloud any message of sympathy attached. "Those beautiful purple azaleas came to you in loving memory from the Smith family," etc. The pastor is supposed to be in the flower service. I peeked into the sanctuary and caught the funeral director's eye. He nodded, indicating that we were ready to begin. I turned to gather Colton and Cassie when Colton pointed to the casket. "What's that, Daddy?" I tried to keep it simple. "That's the casket. The man who died is inside it." Suddenly, Colton's face gathered into that same knot of intense concern. He slammed his fists on his thighs, then pointed one finger at the casket and said in a near shout, "Did that man have Jesus?" Sonia's eyes popped wide and we both glanced at the sanctuary door, terrified. The family inside could hear our son. He had to, Colton went on. "He can't get into heaven if he didn't have Jesus in his heart." Sonia grabbed Colton by the shoulders and tried to shush him, but he was not shushable. Now nearly in tears, Colton twisted in her arms and yelled at me, "He had to know Jesus, Dad." Sonia steered him away from the sanctuary, hustling him toward the front doors of the church with Cassie following. Through the glass doors, I could see Sonia bent down talking to Cassie and Colton outside. Then Cassie took her still struggling brother by the hand and started walking the half block toward home. I didn't know what to think. Where was this sudden concern over whether a stranger was saved, whether he had Jesus in his heart, as Colton put it, coming from? I did know this much. Colton was at that age where if something popped into his head, he just blurted out. Like the time I took him to a restaurant in Madrid, Nebraska, and a guy with really long, straight hair walked in, and Colton asked loudly whether that was a boy or a girl. So we kept Colton away from funerals for a while, if we didn't know for sure the deceased was a Christian. We just didn't know what he would say or do. It wasn't until 4 months after Colton's surgery during our 4th of July trip to meet our new nephew that Sonia and I finally got a clue that something extraordinary had happened to our son. Sure, there had been a string of quirky things Colton had said or done since the hospital. Colton's insisting that we pay Dr. O'Halloran because Jesus used the doctor to help fix him. His statement that Jesus told him that he had to be good. And his strenuous, almost vehement funeral performance. But rushing by as brief scenes in the busyness of family life, those things just seemed, well, kind of cute. Except for the funeral thing, which was just plain weird. But not supernatural weird. It wasn't until we were driving through North Platte on the way to South Dakota that the lights came on. You'll remember I was teasing Colton a little as we drove through town. "Hey Colton, if we turn here, we can go back to the hospital," I said. "Do you want to go back to the hospital?" It was that conversation in which Colton had said that he went up out of his body, that he had spoken with angels and had sat in Jesus' lap. And the way we knew he wasn't making it up was that he was able to tell us what we were doing in another part of the hospital. You were in a little room by yourself praying, and Mommy was in a different room and she was praying and talking on the phone. Not even Sonia had seen me in that little room having my meltdown with God. Suddenly, there in the expedition on our holiday trip, the incidents of the past few months clicked into place like the last few quick twists in a Rubik's Cube solution. Sonia and I realized that this was not the first time Colton had let us know something amazing had happened to him. It was only the most clear cut. By the time we got to Sioux Falls, we were so busy getting to know our cute baby nephew, catching up on family news, and visiting the waterfall that we didn't have a lot of time to discuss Colton's strange revelations. But during the quiet moments before sleep, a flood of images tumbled through my mind, especially those horrible moments I'd spent in that tiny room at the hospital raging against God. I thought I had been alone, pouring out my anger and grief in private, staying strong for Sonia. But my son said he had seen me, yelling at God. Our mini vacation passed without any new disasters, and we returned to Imperial in time for me to preach on Sunday. The following week, Sonia and her friend Sherry headed to Colorado Springs for the Pikes Peak Worship Festival, a conference on church music ministry that left just me and the kids at home. Like any prudent tornado belt family, we have a basement below our one-story home. Ours is semi-finished with a small office and a bathroom that lead off a large multi-purpose playroom area. Colton and I were down there one evening as I worked on a sermon against the comforting background of my preschooler's action figure war. Colton was 3 years and 10 months old at the time of his surgery, but in May we had celebrated his birthday, so he was now officially 4, a big boy. The little party we had thrown was all the more special since we'd nearly lost him. I don't remember exactly what day of the week it was when Colton and I were hanging out in the basement, but I do remember that it was evening and that Cassie wasn't there, so she must have been spending the night with a friend. As Colton played nearby, my attention drifted to our Arby's conversation about Jesus and the angels. I wanted to probe deeper, get him talking again. At that age, little boys don't exactly come up and offer you long, detailed histories, but they will answer direct questions, usually with direct answers. If Colton really had a supernatural encounter, I certainly didn't want to ask him leading questions. We had taught Colton about our faith all his life, but if he had really seen Jesus and the angels, I wanted to become the student, not the teacher. Sitting at my makeshift desk, I looked over at my son as he brought Spider-Man pouncing down on some nasty-looking creature from Star Wars. "Hey Colton," I said, "remember when we were in the car and you talked about sitting on Jesus' lap?" Sitting on his knees, he looked up at me. "Yeah." "Well, did anything else happen?" He nodded, eyes bright. "Did you know that Jesus has a cousin?" "Jesus told me his cousin baptized him." "Yes, you're right," I said. "The Bible says Jesus' cousin's name is John." Mentally, I scolded myself. Don't offer information, just let him talk. "I don't remember his name," Colton said happily, "but he was really nice." John the Baptist is nice, I thought to myself. Just as I was processing the implications of my son's statement that he had met John the Baptist, Colton spied a plastic horse among his toys and held it up for me to look at. "Hey Dad, did you know Jesus has a horse?" "A horse?" "Yeah, a rainbow horse. I got to pet him. There's lots of colors." Lots of colors? What was he talking about? "Where are there lots of colors, Colton?" I asked. "In heaven, Dad. That's where all the rainbow colors are." That set my head spinning. Suddenly I realized that up until that point I'd been toying with the idea that maybe Colton had had some sort of divine visitation. Maybe Jesus and the angels had appeared to him in the hospital. I'd heard of similar phenomena many times when people were as near death as Colton had been. Now it was dawning on me that not only was my son saying he had left his body, he was saying he had left the hospital. "You were in heaven?" I managed to ask. "Well, yeah, Dad," he said, as if that fact should have been perfectly obvious. I had to take a break. I stood up and bounded up the stairs, picked up the phone, and dialed Sonia's cell. She picked up, and I could hear music and singing in the background. "Do you know what your son just said to me?" "What?" she shouted over the noise. "He told me he met John the Baptist." "What?" I summarized the rest for her and could hear the amazement in her voice on the other end of the line. She tried to press me for details, but the worship conference hall was too loud. Finally, we had to give up. "Call me tonight after dinner, okay?" Sonia said. "I want to know everything." I hung up and leaned against the kitchen counter, processing. Slowly, I began to wrap my mind around the possibility that this was real. Had our son died and come back? The medical staff never gave any indication of that, but clearly something had happened to Colton. He had authenticated that by telling us things he couldn't have known. It dawned on me that maybe we'd been given a gift and that our job now was to unwrap it slowly and see what was inside. Back downstairs, Colton was still on his knees, bombing aliens. I sat down beside him. "Hey Colton, can I ask you something else about Jesus?" He nodded, but didn't look up from his devastating attack on a little pile of X-Men. "What did Jesus look like?" I said. Abruptly, Colton put down his toys and looked up at me. Jesus has markers. What? Markers, Daddy. Jesus has markers. And he has brown hair, and he has hair on his face, he said, running his tiny palm around his chin. I guessed he didn't yet know the word beard. And his eyes, oh, Dad, his eyes are so pretty. As he said this, Colton's face grew dreamy and far away, as if enjoying a particularly sweet memory. What about his clothes? Colton snapped back into the room and smiled at me. He had purple on. As he said this, Colton put his hand on his left shoulder and moved it across his body down to his right hip, and then repeated the motion. His clothes were white, but it was purple from here to here. Another word he didn't know. Sash. Jesus was the only one in heaven who had purple on, Dad. Did you know that? In Scripture, purple is the color of kings. A verse from the Gospel of Mark flashed through my mind. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And he had this gold thing on his head, Colton chirped enthusiastically. He put both hands on top of his head in the shape of a circle. Like a crown? Yeah, a crown. And it had this diamond thing in the middle of it, and it was kind of pink. And he has markers, Dad. My mind reeled. Here I'd thought I was leading my child gently down this conversational path, but instead he'd grabbed the reins and galloped away. Images from the Scripture tumbled through my mind. The Christophany, or manifestation of Christ, in the book of Daniel, the appearance of the King of Kings in Revelation. I was amazed that my son was describing Jesus in pretty much human terms, then amazed that I was amazed, since our whole faith revolves around the idea that man is made in God's image, and Jesus both came to earth and returned to heaven as a man. I knew by heart all the Bible stories we'd read him over the years, Bible storybooks that I'd shared with him from my childhood. And I knew our church's Sunday school lessons and how simplified they are in the preschool years. Jesus loves you. Be kind to others. God is good. If you could get a preschooler to take away just one 3 or 4 word concept on Sunday mornings, we considered that a huge accomplishment. Now here was my child in his matter-of-fact preschooler voice telling me things that were not only astonishing on their face, but that also matched Scripture in every detail, right down to the rainbow colors described in the book of Revelation, which is hardly preschool material in most churches. And as he babbled, Colton asked me, his pastor dad, every so often, "Did you know that?" And I'm thinking, yeah, but how do you know that? I sat in silence for a few moments as Colton resumed his bombing campaign against the action figure enemies. As would become a pattern for the next couple of years, I sat there and tried to figure out what to ask him next. I thought through what he had said so far: John the Baptist, Jesus in his clothes, rainbows, horses. I got all that, but what about the markers? What did Colton mean when he said Jesus has markers? What are markers to a little kid? Suddenly I had it. Colton, you said Jesus had markers. You mean like markers that you color with? Colton nodded. Yeah, like colors. He had colors on him. Like when you color a page? Yeah. Well, what color are Jesus' markers? Red, Daddy. Jesus has red markers on him. At that moment, my throat nearly closed with tears as I suddenly understood what Colton was trying to say. Quietly, I said, "Colton, where are Jesus' markers?" Without hesitation, he stood to his feet. He held out his right hand and pointed to the center of it with his left, then held out his left palm and pointed with his right hand. Finally, Colton bent over and pointed to the tops of both his feet. "That's where Jesus' markers are, Daddy," he said. I drew in a sharp breath. He saw this. He had to have. We know where the nails were driven when Jesus was crucified, but you don't spend a lot of time going over those gruesome facts with toddlers and preschoolers. In fact, I didn't know if my son had ever seen a crucifix. Children in Catholic families grow up with that image, but children in Protestant families, especially young ones, usually grow up with just a general concept that Jesus died on the cross for us. I was also struck by how quickly Colton answered my questions. He spoke with the simple conviction of an eyewitness, not the carefulness of someone remembering the right answers and trying to say the right thing, or answers learned in a Sunday school lesson or from a book. Colton, I'm going to get some water, I said, really only wanting to exit the conversation. Whether or not he was done, I was done. I had enough information to chew on for a while. Okay, Daddy, Colton said and bent to his toys. Upstairs in the kitchen, I leaned against the counter and sipped from a water bottle. How could my little boy know this stuff? I knew he wasn't making it up. I was pretty sure neither Sonia nor I had ever talked to Colton about what Jesus wore at all, much less what he might be wearing in heaven. Could he have picked up such a detail from the Bible stories we read to the children? More of Colton's knowledge about our faith came from that than from a month of Sundays. But again, the stories in the Bible storybooks we read to him were very narrative-oriented, just a couple of 100 words each. Not at all heavy on details like Jesus wearing white, yet the scripture says he did, and no details on what heaven might be like. I took another sip of water and racked my brain about the cousin thing and the markers. He didn't get that stuff from us. But even on the details he didn't understand at first, like the markers, Colton was insistent. And there was another thing about the markers that nagged me. When I asked Colton what Jesus looked like, that was the first detail he popped out with. Not the purple sash, the crown, or even Jesus' eyes, with which Colton was clearly enchanted. He said right off the bat, Jesus has markers. I'd once heard a spiritual riddle that went like this: what's the only thing in heaven that's the same as it was on earth? The answer, the wounds in Jesus' hands and feet.